Hello, my name is Joshua Concanon, and this is a presentation on one of the greatest advancements of the past 50 years, open source. On the agenda is first the idea and history behind open source. Then we will move in to discuss the unique part of open source, and that is licensing. We will then move on to view the uses of it, some examples, and the biggest utilizer of it, Linux. Lastly, we will look at its main supporters and then what the future looks like for open source. Open source is the creative practice of appropriation and free sharing of creations and modifications using licensing and source codes. Open source is the idea, and open source software is the main application in computer software. Open source emerged out of a free software movement who were critical of the political agenda and moral philosophy implied in the term free software, and sought to reframe the discourse to reflect a more commercially minded position. Christine Patterson first coined the term at a meeting in Palo Alto, California. The open source movement began as a response to the limitations of proprietary code, but has since spread across different fields, and as you can see, it has grown immensely since the 1980s. The Open Source Initiative is a global nonprofit that protects and promotes open source, championing open source in society through education, collaboration, and infrastructure, stewarding the open source definition, and preventing the abuse of the concept. Speaking of the open source definition, all licenses must comply with the open source definition. The licenses are what allows the software to be freely used, modified, and shared. Like I said, the open source definition is the guideline for all licenses. They first say that licenses must allow redistribution. They must have a source code, they must allow works to be derived from them, and they must allow integrity. It then says the licenses must not discriminate against people or groups, or against fields or endeavors. And then it cannot be specific to one product. It then may not be technologically neutral or restrict certain software programs. Open source was originally created to give people the ability to collaborate on efforts and to unify projects. It has been misused, unfortunately. For example, there are a lot of forked versions of things, which are just modified versions that are not shared or beneficial to others. One concrete example of an ethical open source product is open source cola. It is very similar to Coke or Pepsi, but the recipe is open source and is developed by numerous independent volunteers, rather than keeping the recipe secret like Coca-Cola or Pepsi. Open source cola makes it available to the public. Another example is Wikimedia, which focuses on information made available to the public, where changes can be made and information can be spread. The last example I will share is the open source drug discovery for Malaria Consortium, one of the many open source projects in medicine. The next part of the presentation is about Linux, one of the biggest utilizers of open source. Linux is a computer operating system assembled under the model of free and open source software development and distribution. The defining component of Linux is the Linux kernel, an operating system that was first released in October of 1991. It was originally developed as a free operating system for personal computers, but has developed immensely since then. The features of Linux, in addition to open source, are that it is always for multi-programming, it has greater security than your typical operating system, it is portable, and it allows multi-user systems. Many of the greatest supporters of open source often go unnoticed. Apache Software Foundation is one of the biggest supporters of open source and has developed products in two separate spheres. One is Apache Hadoop, and the other is Apache HTTP. It is very important to be knowledgeable of open source alternatives because there is one for any and every application, and they are always free, so you should check them out. Open source has made an impact outside of its own reach. For example, it has increased transparency and liberty in biotechnology research. Moreover, it has led to an expansion in the open source hardware movement and the open source initiative. And here are my sources that I've gathered to create this presentation. And that about wraps up my presentation on open source. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to check out your open source alternatives. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.